Washington and people around the world are remembering Senator John McCain. We learned his final words to the American people on Monday. But first, here are some of his other memorable ones.
I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No?
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with. Let's trust each other. Let's return to regular order. We've been spinning our wheels on too many important issues because we keep trying to find a way to win without help from across the aisle. To fear the world we have organized and led the 3/4 of a century, to abandon the ideals we have advanced around the globe, to refuse the obligations of international leadership and our duty to remain the last best hope of Earth for the sake of some half-baked, spurious nationalism cooked up by people who would rather find scapegoats than solve problems, is as unpatriotic as an attachment to any other tired dogma of the past that Americans consigned to the ash heap of history.
Ahead on Red and Blue, President Trump announces a trade understanding with Mexico. And Arizona holds primaries days after Senator McCain's death. What to watch for in those races and in Florida's elections on Tuesday. Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. We begin on Capitol Hill, where lawmakers remembered Arizona Senator John McCain. McCain's desk on the Senate floor was covered with black fabric with a vase of white roses in the middle. Several senators took to the floor to share their memories of McCain and express what his legacy meant to the American people. Here's some of what Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said.
For his colleagues here, the time confirmed a sad but obvious truth. The Senate won't be the same without John McCain. Because while John proudly served with us as the senator for Arizona, he was America's hero all along. I will miss one of the very finest gentlemen with whom I've had the honor to serve. But we will not forget him. I consider it our privilege to return some small share of the love that John poured out for this country.
Earlier in the day, McCain's former presidential campaign manager and longtime confidant, Rick Davis, read the senator's final letter to the American people. In it, McCain called himself the luckiest person on earth and expressed his love and pride for his family.
Thank you for the privilege of serving you and for the rewarding life that service in uniform and in public office has allowed me to lead. I've tried to serve our country honorably. I've made mistakes, but I hope my love for America will be weighed favorably against them. 10 years ago, I had the privilege to concede defeat in the election for president. I want to end my farewell to you with heartfelt faith in Americans that I felt so powerfully that evening. I feel it powerfully still. Do not despair of our present difficulties. We believe always in the promise and greatness of America, because nothing is inevitable here. Americans never quit. We never surrender. We never hide from history. We make history. Farewell, fellow Americans. God bless you, and God bless America.
Several days of remembrance ceremonies are planned for McCain. He will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol later this week. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is also proposing renaming the Russell Senate Office Building after the late senator. Both Schumer and McConnell requested that all U.S. flags remain at half-staff through McCain's burial on Sunday. However, the White House flag was seen at full staff Monday morning after flying at half-staff for part of Sunday. The flag was lowered back to half-staff later in the afternoon. President Trump ignored several questions about McCain that were shouted at him by reporters at the White House Monday.
Mr. President, any thoughts on John McCain? The American Legion has asked you to lower the flags to half-staff. Any reaction to the American Legion? Any action to the American Legion asking you to put a proclamation about John McCain? Why won't you say anything about John McCain?
Let's go. Make your way out. Let's go. Press. Let's go. We're finished. Let's go.
Thank you very much.
President Trump finally addressed McCain's death on camera at an evangelical dinner he hosted at the White House Monday night.
Also, our hearts and prayers are going to the family of Senator John McCain. Going to be a lot of activity over the next number of days, and we very much appreciate everything that Senator McCain has done for our country. So thank you very much.
Joining me now are CBSN political contributor and political reporter for The Guardian, Sabrina Siddiqui, and senior congressional correspondent for The Washington Post, Paul Kane. Thanks to you both for joining us. Sabrina, let me start with you. The funeral plans for Senator McCain will span the better part of this week. What does that say about Senator McCain's legacy?
Well, I think we've seen tributes pour in from across the globe praising Senator McCain, not just for the 6 decades of service he held in Congress, but also, of course, as a decorated Vietnam War hero. He, of course, spent, as we all know, 5.5 years as a prisoner of war. And he really does represent this old guard in Washington who I think spent the last few years, certainly amid the rise of then-candidate Trump and now President Trump, trying to warn against the country going into another direction that broke from a lot of the norms and the institutions that he believes he fought to uphold. So I think that you are seeing a reflection of that in the respect that he's received from both sides of the aisle and the way in which he will be memorialized in the course of this coming week. And yet again, that is what made the response from the White House so striking that even in this moment, it took the president 2 days to issue a statement and a proclamation that any of his predecessors would have done in the immediate moments after we learned of Senator McCain's passing.
And we should note that the president did that after the American Legion, which represents millions of U.S. veterans, actually asked President Trump to do so. Paul, let me turn to you. In a recent piece, you called Senator McCain a, quote, force of nature in Washington with an unrivaled global stature. What type of void does his death create on Capitol Hill?
McCain was really the last of the great Senate chairmen that really sort of drove this place in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They have all literally retired or died off, people like Ted Kennedy. These were the forces of nature who, even if leadership, their own party leadership, didn't support what they were doing, these guys could get their bills onto the floor and at least get debate. John McCain, back in 1998 and 99, he got stuff like tobacco reform legislation, campaign finance reform. He would, through the sheer force of his character, got bills onto the floor. And even if leadership was opposed to them, he could still get a debate going. Nowadays, it's so much more of a top-down structure in which, Mitch McConnell today boasts about he is the decider of what gets onto the House floor. You just don't have people like that anymore who are able to sort of build their own coalition and just sort of steamroll leadership. It's basically now just a top-down institution.
Well, Sabrina, let me ask you, former Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama will deliver eulogies at Senator McCain's funeral. What's the significance of that, where you have not just a Republican and a Democrat, but the two men who essentially ended Senator McCain's presidential bids, that they are the ones he specifically chose to eulogize him?
I think a lot of that goes back to the way in which Senator McCain viewed public service. And to Paul's point, he was very much one of the last great statesmen in American politics. And so a lot of what you see in terms of the support and the outpouring of affection that's come from both of those predecessors, his former political opponents, Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, has to do with honoring that legacy. And what he stood for. As is the case with any politician, he wasn't perfect, and he acknowledged that in his parting words. The letter that was released today, he certainly was not immune to criticism, but one thing that he respected was the democratic process in this country and the fact that Americans ultimately twice chose another leader to be ultimately elevated to the White House. And when you think about just the way in which he did advocate for being gracious, even in the face of defeat, that is a lot of, I think, also why he has taken issue with President Trump and the way in which he has governed, the way in which he has simply not shown himself to be willing to follow suit in the same way of civility that really, I think, ruled the way in which McCain approached at least his outlook when it came to public service.
Well, and Paul, it's interesting, Senator Chuck Schumer of New York is pushing to rename the Russell Senate Office Building after Senator McCain. What does it say that you have a Democrat trying to rename a building after a Republican? And also, how likely do you think it is that Schumer will be successful?
Yeah, I'm standing here in the Russell Building itself, on the third floor of the Russell Building. We believe it only takes a act of the Senate. I don't think this needs to be a full legislative issue, but apparently Mitch McConnell is not rushing to join Schumer in that idea. I think he wants to talk to his colleagues about it. This has been talked about for a while. Richard Russell had some real sort of segregationist views when he was a Southern Democrat, and I think Schumer sees it as sort of a healing gesture to all sides. He would be replacing a Democrat with a Republican in the building, but it would be somebody who tried to view his role as somebody that really forged unity. And I think you pretty much saw that, and one of the reasons you've got Obama up there speaking is because McCain was so gracious in defeat in 2008 in that concession speech, and it's his sort of way of trying to bring the country together. And I think Schumer is trying to do that with this building that I'm standing in to try and make another gesture toward that same unity.
Paul, I'm curious, though, what would be the arguments against such a gesture? I mean, I know obviously this is still very early yet, but it's interesting that you say Senator McConnell is not necessarily sort of rushing to join Senator Schumer in this effort.
Yeah. This has been an ongoing effort for about 15 years or so. There were some activists, civil rights activists, early this century, 2002, 2003, that were trying to do this. And there were defenders of Russell who said that was his views on segregation were just only a small part of what he stood for. And there were some that believed at the time that he was a great figure for helping the military. He was chairman of the Armed Services Committee, which McCain himself has now been chairman of for several years. That's been just a sort of touchy, dicey subject. I think senators from Georgia will want to have to weigh in on this. It's just unclear right now. It's a little too soon to know whether folks will all uniformly join in on this.
Interesting. Well, switching topics now, President Trump announced that the United States and Mexico reached a deal to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement. Sabrina, what details do we know about this trade agreement?
As is often the case, there was a great deal of pomp and circumstance around the announcement, but little by way of substance, because the fact of the matter is there is not a new deal that has been agreed upon between the United States and Mexico. What the two countries have come to an agreement on is a framework, at least in principle, in order to try and resolve some of the key differences that they hold with respect to NAFTA. Now, there have been ongoing negotiations with respect to NAFTA between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada since the Trump administration came in more than a year and a half ago that have yet to produce a new agreement. And one thing that was notable was that the Mexican president, Enrique Nieto, said very clearly today that he still believes that any new agreement would have to involve the participation of Canada, whereas the White House is framing this as having forged two new bilateral agreements, one with Mexico and another pending with Canada, when there simply isn't any evidence yet to support that we are yet at that stage. So we have to wait and see what may be forthcoming. But as we've seen time and again, they have a tendency to go through with a rollout that seems to show or demonstrate that the work is done when we don't actually yet know what the fine print is, or even what the framework itself will ultimately mean in terms of an actual change in policy.
And Paul, a new trade agreement requires congressional approval. What are some of the hurdles it will have to overcome on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I think the overall tone Congress was happy to see. At least it was cordial toward Mexico, considering where Trump had been in the campaign and his early days as president. So they appreciated the nice tone, but there's a lot of details left to be filled in. And this is a Congress that has shown time and again it struggles with some of the most basic legislative hurdles. A trade agreement with Mexico is a really big deal, and I have a hard time seeing any type of approval of that happening at least until next year. We're in election season up here, and they're just trying to get through some of the most basic things for the next couple of months. And then who knows who's going to control the majority next year. There are a whole host of issues, unknowns, that would have to be answered before we get to a congressional approval.
Far more complicated, I think, than folks might understand. Sabrina Siddiqui and Paul Kane, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Coming up, what comes next for the special counsel investigation after Paul Manafort's conviction and Michael Cohen's plea deal? We'll discuss that next. Stay with us. You're streaming Red and Blue on CBSN. President Trump was dealt a series of devastating legal blows last week. His former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was found guilty of 8 federal crimes on Tuesday. The same day, his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, pleaded guilty to 8 federal charges in a separate case. Cohen implicated the president in his crimes, saying he made hush money payments in violation of campaign finance laws at Trump's direction. Then on Friday, Alan Weisselberg, the Trump Organization's chief financial officer, was granted immunity from prosecution in the Cohen case in exchange for his testimony. Here with me is Rebecca Roife. She is a professor of law at New York Law School and a former assistant district attorney in the New York County District Attorney's Office. Professor Roife, always good to see you. Let's start with Alan Weisselberg. That's a name that's not necessarily familiar to our viewers, but perhaps is familiar to people who have been following the twists and turns of this case. He was a CFO of the Trump Organization. And now that you have him turning state's evidence, I wonder what possible information could he have that would be of interest to the investigators?
Well, first of all, just to clarify, he has not cooperated. He's been given immunity in exchange for his testimony in the grand jury. So that's an important distinction, and one that actually gives a little bit of a clue. So the fact that he's done that means that we know that at least he or his lawyers think that he has exposure to some kind of criminal act. We don't know that the prosecutors can charge that or have enough proof to charge it, but there's something about his involvement with crimes. Now, if your CFO is involved in criminal activity, that tends to mean that you're involved in criminal activity. Not always, but sometimes. And a CFO knows where basically knows where the dead bodies are buried. They know where every single, especially
any transaction that's happened,
anything that
any
has
money
to do
that
with,
was moved from this pot to that pot, they would know about.
CEOs are quaking in their boots in a white-collar case if their CFO is cooperating in any way, so even just in a grand jury investigation. So I would think that this would give the president a great concern, perhaps the most yet.
Because there is a suggestion here that there is some exposure, as you say, which means that could then perhaps reflect on Donald Trump's actions.
Yeah, I mean, well, we already have Michael Cohen in his plea deal essentially saying that he conspired with the President of the United States.
At the direction.
At the direction.
Of the
so
candidate.
that's both aiding and abetting and conspiring. But conspiracy is a whole separate federal charge that comes with a fairly high sentence. So conspiracy is a scary thing if you're facing it. And so I think, yes, conspiracy, possibly aiding and abetting. So all of those things have already been mentioned. And in open court, somebody has pled guilty, which means that both the Southern District of New York believes that that's true. Michael Cohen believes that that's true and has admitted to it. And as much as the president, till he's blue in the face, denies that that's a crime, we have professional prosecutors saying that's a crime and they have proof of it.
So it's interesting. The notion of the president's tax returns has been something that his critics have certainly focused on. You now have a former ethics lawyer for former President George W. Bush saying Friday that this may be key for Bob Mueller if he's trying to get information about Donald Trump's tax returns. And I'm wondering, as a former ADA, how informative, how illuminating can a person's tax returns be?
Hugely illuminating. And I spent a lot of time prosecuting white-collar crimes, and that, that is extremely good evidence. It gives you a lot of clues and sometimes actually the proof you need in order to make the links to some kind of criminal activity.
So the Atlantic also wrote an article asking if New York prosecutors could pose a bigger threat to Donald Trump than Special Counsel Mueller. And I wonder if you agree with that notion, because we know when it comes to this idea of, a pardon, that there are limits as to what a president is able to do in that regard.
Right. So I think the Southern District of New York and the New York Attorney General's office do pose a greater legal risk to the president right now than Mueller. That's because Mueller's investigation is constrained. He's been very careful about keeping within its boundaries. Of course, if he can prove that there was collusion with Russia, I mean, that's like checkmate. I mean, it's all over. But there are these other issues that are very, very important. And you're absolutely right in terms of the New York AG's office, which is that a pardon won't help him. And there are New York prosecutors sort of lurking in the background, too, so that if President Trump were to pardon himself or to pardon Cohen, there are certainly New York crimes that could be charged. And I think a pardon, I mean, look, it's not like it wouldn't be useful for any of these individuals, but it isn't necessarily the end of their story.
Well, finally, Politico is reporting that a little-noticed court case entirely unrelated to Bob Mueller's probe could have enormous implications for the future of the information from the Mueller investigation. Can you explain to us what this is about? Because, of course, there's a great deal of interest once the Mueller investigation ends about the public having full access to his findings.
Yeah, well, that is a big drama in that court case, and it's a court case brought by a former journalist who's building this story about unrelated, about a Columbia professor who was murdered quite a long time ago and wants to get some information. I actually think this is a bit of a red herring in the Mueller investigation. I think that, look, prosecutors are always allowed to share grand jury information to the extent that it furthers their criminal investigation or legitimate law enforcement purposes. I don't know how you wouldn't see the impeachment of the president, or at least informing Congress about the president's crimes, as a legitimate law enforcement purpose. So I think this is a different case. I think it's a case that's interesting and has a lot of implications for public knowledge.
Applicable here.
I just don't think it would end. I know that there are others who disagree, but I just don't think that this is going to end up having huge implications for Mueller and his team. I think that, first of all, it's not going to apply at all if in November the Democrats win, because they can always subpoena the information. So this would only apply to the voluntary turning over of the information, which people have suggested is one of the avenues that Mueller might take, which is at the end of his investigation, instead of charging, creating a report and turning it over to Congress. So theoretically, if there's some, if this opinion is drafted in an incredibly broad way, it could maybe affect Mueller. But courts don't tend to draft things, especially when they have to do with important things like grand juries, in incredibly broad ways. So my guess is this will be a narrow case when it comes down and won't affect the Mueller probe. But, I guess one doesn't know for sure until it comes down.
One more for you, and I know this involves a crystal ball. Nevertheless, with Allen Weisselberg now cooperating, Or being given immunity, do you think that gives us any better sense of a time frame here? Because, this is always the $64,000 question, is how much longer, right?
Yeah.
The president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, has tried to suggest that perhaps September, but does this give us any inkling as to when it might end?
I don't think Rudy Giuliani knows at all, and I think he's playing when he says that and sort of manipulating public opinion. But I do think all of these cooperators mean something, that prosecutors build cases where there are cooperators, and we keep finding out more and more about additional cooperators.
And this is a big cooperator.
This is a big cooperator, but there are many of them, and I think we're going to see more charges, and I think we're going to see them relatively soon.
More to come. Professor Rebecca Roiphe, thanks so much. Always great to have your insight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
One of Vladimir Putin's most prominent critics, Alexei Navalny, was sentenced to a month in jail Monday. A Moscow court found the Russian opposition leader guilty of holding an unsanctioned anti-government protest back in January. This will put the 42-year-old Navalny behind bars for his next rally, which is scheduled for early September. Navalny is routinely jailed for organizing protests and urged his supporters to come out next month despite his absence. Well, 50 years ago this month, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago erupted into violence. In a piece for CBS Sunday Morning, Scott Simon of NPR took us back to that time.
Worlds collided at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Young and old, war and peace, law and order.
You can't take that week in isolation. 68, one of the most dramatic and traumatic years in the nation's history.
Let's on to Chicago and let's win there. Thank you.
They kind of all rolled to Chicago, and you could feel it coming.
Bill Daley, who would become President Obama's chief of staff, was a college student and spent the convention at the side of his father, Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley.
We knew that there was going to be an enormous challenge on the streets, and my father believed that he was the defender of the city.
No more war! The peace groups are demanding permission to march on Convention Hall the night the Democrats nominate their candidate for president.
With thousands of protesters expected, 12,000 Chicago police officers were deployed, along with the National Guard.
A Democratic convention is about to begin in a police state. There just doesn't seem to be any other way to say it.
The country was being torn apart by the Vietnam War.
Not long before joining CBS News, Bob Schieffer was a young reporter in 1968, attending his first national convention.
It was supposed to be a place where the Democrats were going to get their business all together, but everybody knew it was going to be difficult.
I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
President Johnson was forced out by the success of Senator Eugene McCarthy in New Hampshire. Robert Kennedy was assassinated the night he won the California primary. Vice President Hubert Humphrey didn't enter any primaries, but was favored to win the nomination.
Hubert Humphrey was the establishment, and he represented the big bosses and the traditional Democratic Party. The politicians, the big city mayors, they were certainly not satisfied with Gene McCarthy. His sole campaign was, I'll end the war in Vietnam.
The city said in a year of assassinations and riots, it couldn't grant permits to protesters to march on the convention or sleep in city parks.
We knew the convention was coming to town, and we knew that there was probably going to be some problems. We were getting pelted.
Bill Giaconetti was a rookie policeman in 1968, posted to the protests in Grant Park.
I had come home from Korea. I was stationed on the DMZ, and the next trip, all my buddies went to Vietnam.
Wednesday night, August 28th, the confrontation that had been building all week, probably all year, burst open on the street between Grant Park and the convention headquarters hotel.
The first deputy said, clear the streets. After the final warning, he said, if you don't move out of the street, my officers are going to clear the street. And that's what we had to do on that night.
They're just swinging their clubs like just a bunch of idiots.
The problem wasn't the regular people. The problem was the agitators, and there were a lot of them. My partner next to me, he caught a house brick in the chest. They had to take him to the hospital.
The notion that anybody came to the party with the idea of a big fight is wrong.
Marilyn Katz was the 23-year-old head of security for Students for a Democratic Society.
I understand that they felt that, one, they should keep control of their city, and that the Democratic Party and the mayor was saying, we're counting on you to keep things in order. There was no excuse for beating us.
Did you ever see anyone throw anything at police officers?
Yes, I did. And if I had had something, I would have thrown it back too, because we had done nothing.
The violence in Grant Park was indeed seen all over the world and at the convention.
We've just received some film of the police and the demonstrators,
where anti-war delegates erupted.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Despite the uproar, Humphrey won the Democratic nomination by more than 1,000 votes. But
once all these riots had broken out and all this trouble had happened in Chicago, the nomination wasn't worth the paper it was written on.
When it goes that far, it's time to make a change.
Richard Nixon ran on a law and order platform and won the presidency in a close election. And at the end of 1968, a special commission called what happened that night on the streets of Chicago a police riot. Bill Giaconetti, who would be decorated in 1979 for taking 2 bullets to free 13 hostages, says,
well, it wasn't the police riot.
And Marilyn Katz, now a well-connected public relations executive, agrees.
I think that puts too much blame on the individual cops. I think that Daley made a mistake. Mm-hmm. He really wanted to maintain control of his city and demonstrate it.
Richard J. Daley would be reelected twice after 1968, but his actions at the Democratic Convention he brought home that year would stain his image in history and the party and city he loved.
Did your father ever have second thoughts about his actions or anything he should have done differently? Which
probably regretted getting the convention, but he never really said that. He was defensive around the police action because he thought that they were provoked, challenged. Yeah, he wished it didn't happen.
In the heat of emotion and riot, some policemen may have overacted.
But he was not somebody to go back and anguish over decisions made. In those times, with the energy, things were black and white. There was good, there was bad. Cops are bad, you know, demonstrators are good.
I remember.
Yeah, but life's more gray.
Coming up, some of Senator John McCain's neighbors are remembering his life in Arizona, plus the war hero's final words to the American people. Stay with us. You're streaming Red and Blue on CBSN. The McCains have had a home in Cornville, Arizona for more than 20 years. It was a special place to them. Morgan Lowe from our Phoenix affiliate KPHO drove around the region to find out how Senator McCain's neighbors are mourning his death and celebrating his life.
This is the view of the mountains and the sky that John McCain chose to see and feel and breathe during his final months. And the communities that shared this space with him are mourning the loss of their neighbor and their senator. It's right by the mailboxes near the flowers on the side of the road. A small wooden sign. You can barely make out the words Hidden Valley, but it tells these people they're at the right place.
He always fought for the veteran, and especially the Vietnam vet.
Rocky and Nancy Beria are here today to pay their respects to a fellow Vietnam vet.
I was there in '68 and '69.
They are among the steady stream of people stopping by the entrance to the McCain Ranch, driven by a need to say thank you.
I didn't agree with everything he said and everything he did, but overall I thought he was one heck of a nice guy.
Up the state highway in Clarkdale, the town flag sits at half-staff. Just a couple of miles away in Cottonwood, clouds roll in overhead. People are eating in the cafes and talking about what their high-profile neighbor meant to the community.
I'm just very saddened. I was neighbors with him around the corner, literally, from him in Cornville.
The road through nearby Cornville has American flags lining the fences. And back in Hidden Valley, at the entrance to the McCain Ranch, these words resonate.
There'll never be another John McCain. He's really one of a kind.
After spending a couple of days up here, you get the idea that the neighbors didn't really give much of a fuss about the McCains. And that might have been their final gift, allowing this world figure to live out his final months as a regular person. In Cornville, I'm Morgan Lowe for Arizona's Family.
Shortly after his cancer diagnosis last year, Senator McCain sat down for his final interview with 60 Minutes. He told Leslie Stahl he's had a wonderful life.
Let me go back to the diagnosis for 1 minute. What did they tell you about the prognosis?
That it's very serious. It's a very poor prognosis. But I do not mean to be maudlin or anything, but I have had the best life that anyone I've ever known has ever had. So.
Is it true that you told Lindsey Graham, I'm going to quote, I have been through worse? Do you really think that? Well, of course, you did go through the torture and the...
Yeah, when I was first shot down.
So you think that this battle is not as great as that battle that you fought?
That battle was something in some ways I could control. I needed to heal. I needed to try to exercise. I needed to fight. So it was a battle that I knew the odds and I knew what I had to do. I knew the code of conduct, etc. And I had all these guys around me, you know, come on, we're with you, and tapping on the walls and all that kind of stuff. So it's a different kind of a fight, it really is.
Yeah, you can't see the enemy.
You can't see the enemy.
You can't know the enemy.
That's one of the biggest problems. And you know that this is a particularly vicious kind of adversary, and we cannot underestimate him. But could I say one more time? I've had the best life of anybody that could ever known, and I want to celebrate my life. That's what I want to do.
McCain family spokesman and former campaign manager Rick Davis read Senator John McCain's final letter to the American people on Monday. Take a listen.
These are John's words. My fellow Americans, whom I have gratefully served for 60 years, and especially my fellow Arizonians, thank you for the privilege of serving you and for the rewarding life that service in uniform and in public office has allowed me to lead. I've tried to serve our country honorably. I've made mistakes, but I hope my love for America will be weighed favorably against them. I've often observed that I am the luckiest person on earth. I feel that way even now as I prepare for the end of my life. I've loved my life, all of it. I've had experiences, adventures, friendships, enough for 10 satisfying lives, and I am so thankful. Like most people, I have regrets, but I would not trade a day of my life, in good or bad times, for the best day of anybody else's. I owe the satisfaction to the love of my family. One man has never had a more loving wife or children he was prouder of than I am of mine. And I owe it to America to be connected to America's causes, liberty, equal justice, respect for the dignity of all people, brings happiness more sublime than life's fleeting pleasures. Our identities and sense of worth are not circumscribed, but are enlarged by serving good causes bigger than ourselves. Fellow Americans, that association has meant more to me than any other. I lived and died a proud American. We are citizens of the world's greatest republic, a nation of ideals, not blood and soil. We are blessed and are a blessing to humanity when we uphold and advance those ideals at home and in the world. We have helped liberate more people from tyranny and poverty than ever before in history, and we have acquired great wealth and power in the progress. We weaken our greatness when we confuse our patriotism with tribal rivalries that have sown resentment and hatred and violence in all the corners of the globe. We weaken it when we hide behind walls rather than tear them down, when we doubt the power of our ideals rather than trust them to be the great force for change they have always been. We are 325 million opinionated, vociferous individuals. We argue and compete and sometimes even vilify each other in our raucous public debates. But we have always had so much more in common with each other than in disagreement. If only we remember that and give each other the benefit of the presumption that we all love our country, we will get through these challenging times. We will come through them stronger than before. We always do. 10 years ago, I had the privilege to concede defeat in the election for president. I want to end my farewell to you with heartfelt faith in Americans that I felt so powerfully that evening. I feel it powerfully still. Do not despair of our present difficulties. We believe always in the promise and greatness of America, because nothing is inevitable here. Americans never quit. We never surrender. We never hide from history. We make history. Farewell, fellow Americans. God bless you, and God bless America.
Two states are holding primaries Tuesday, Florida and Arizona. The Sunshine State is hosting statewide primaries just days after a gunman killed 2 and injured 11 others at a video game tournament in Jacksonville. Sunday's shooting comes just 6 months after 17 students were killed at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School down the coast in Parkland. Tuesday's primaries are closed, meaning you can only vote in the primary for the party you're registered with. And if you're not already registered, you won't be able to participate Tuesday. But you can vote in the November general election if you register by October 9th. Earlier, I spoke to CBS Miami investigative reporter Jim DeFede about the races to watch. Florida's Republican Governor Rick Scott is running against incumbent Democratic Senator Bill Nelson. What are the issues defining this race?
Well, right now, the major issue is the environment and specifically the blue-green algae crisis that you've seen coming out of Lake Okeechobee. Both the governor, the current governor, and the senator are blaming each other. The governor says that this has been a federal responsibility that they've been lacking, and Bill Nelson has not led on the issue. Bill Nelson counters by saying that it's the policies of the governor weakening water quality standards in the state that have led to the toxic algae bloom that you're seeing. That's playing out across the state right now.
Do we know, is there a way to tell who voters actually blame for that?
I think that it's a pox on both their houses, but I will tell you that Governor Scott has been much more effective in terms of really trying to push this issue and place the blame on Bill Nelson. Again, citing the fact that Bill Nelson has been there for decades and as yet this problem still persists. So I think just from a media standpoint, the governor has made the most inroads on that.
Well, let's look at the race to replace Governor Scott. There is a crowded Democratic primary. Who's pulling ahead here?
Look, I can tell you that every day I get a different poll from a different candidate swearing they're leading in the race. But most of the polls have shown consistently that Gwen Graham, the daughter of former governor, former Senator Bob Graham, is ahead. I would think that that seems to be about right. Based on what I've been seeing around the state, it seems that Gwen Graham has got a slight lead. But again, you've also got, Philip Levine, who is doing a good job as well of trying to come up, and Jeff Green, the billionaire, is spending a lot of money. I'm not sure if Jeff Green's money is making a difference in terms of bringing his numbers up, but I do think they pulled Gwen Graham's down.
What about the Republican side of the governor's race? Congressman Ron DeSantis is running against State Agriculture Commissioner Adam Putnam. And it was interesting, we saw the president campaign in Tampa for DeSantis last month. What role is President Trump actually playing in this primary?
It cannot be understated, the role that the president has played. The way I like to sort of convey this race is it's almost like the Republican primary for president in 2016, whereas Jeb Bush and Donald Trump went at it. Adam Putnam is sort of the Jeb Bush-like candidate, the establishment guy who's been around a long time. Everyone thought it was his turn. And then along came Donald Trump and really upset the apple cart. Well, along comes Ron DeSantis and has upset the problems for Adam Putnam. Look, the president put out an early tweet that basically said that he was supporting Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis, not surprisingly, has been an avid supporter in Congress of the president, a defender of the president. And once the president made his preference clear, it had a huge advantage for Ron DeSantis in terms of fundraising, and the numbers started to go his way. Most people think that Ron DeSantis is ahead. Again, there's one or two polls that say the race is tightened, but most people think that Ron DeSantis is ahead in that race. And so you're going to have a candidate on the right who definitely has embraced Donald Trump, and on the left, you've got all the candidates there wanting also to make this a referendum on the president.
Interesting. Well, finally, I want to ask you about Florida's 27th congressional district. Republican Ileana Ros-Lehtinen is retiring, and the candidate getting the most attention is former HHS Secretary Donna Shalala. What can you tell us about this race?
So Ileana Ros-Lehtinen was the first, Cuban elected to Congress. She is a legend. She's the only person who could win a district that is traditionally blue. But she's retiring. I think she sees the handwriting on the wall. This is a district that Hillary Clinton won by 20 points. The Democrats see this race as pivotal to them taking back the House. You have a lot of Democrats in that field, as you said. Donna Shalala, the former University of Miami president, former head of Health and Human Services under Bill Clinton, she seems to be out in front. But I will tell you, there are a lot of Republicans that hope that Donna Shalala is the nominee for one simple reason. They believe that if it's a generic Democrat versus a generic Republican, then the Democrats are likely to win that race easily. But if they can make Donna Shalala the issue, use her as sort of saying she's part of the past. She's 77 years old. She's tied to she was also the CEO and president of the Clinton Foundation. If they can tie her to Clinton, if they can tie her to past Democratic issues, then there's a feeling that they may be able to make some inroads. But the Democrats believe they've got that race fairly strongly, and I wouldn't bet against it.
All right, interesting dynamics down there in Florida. Jim DeFede of CBS Miami, thanks very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Arizona's primaries will take place this week, just days after Senator John McCain died at 81. McCain had been diagnosed with brain cancer just over a year ago. The Arizona senator is being remembered across the nation as an iconic political figure and maverick. His death also raises questions around the future of the Republican Party in Arizona. Editor and publisher at the Tucson Sentinel, Dylan Smith, joins us now. Dylan, first of all, who are the potential contenders to fill John McCain's seat, and what does that process look like?
Well, the process is pretty simple. It's up to the governor to decide. Governor Doug Ducey gets to appoint someone who will serve through not this general election, but the next general election coming up in 2020. And that person who was elected then will serve out the final 2 years of what was John McCain's term. We've heard a number of names floated, and some of them seem to be given some political considerations, probably not as likely as others, given the state of the Republican Party nationally. And I mean, I would assume, and we're hearing that the Arizona Republicans are looking for somebody who can work effectively with President Trump. And a lot of those folks who are being talked about are not going to be those people. Cindy McCain, given the contentious relationship between John McCain and President Trump, is probably not on that shortest of short lists. Somebody else we've heard about, former Arizona Attorney General Grant Woods, is probably also not on that list because he's somebody who endorsed Hillary Clinton last time around. There are some others who may be a short-term placeholder through that next election cycle, somebody like former Senator John Kyle. But there hasn't been a whole lot of public discussion about this from the governor's side. Of course, he's flat out said for the past year that anybody who approached him to try and get this nomination would pretty much eliminate themselves.
Let's turn to the Arizona primaries taking place on Tuesday. How much of an influence was Senator McCain in these upcoming elections?
Well, I think especially in the other Senate race that we have going on to fill the seat of Jeff Flake, who's retiring, people have been on the Republican side basically running against the legacy of John McCain and trying to get as far away from him as possible and get as cozy with President Trump as possible. And that's because of the considerations of a Republican primary race where you've got very active Tea Party folks. That's kind of really been a different thing than in the past, where for decades now, John McCain has been a driving force in federal elections in Arizona. Now we're seeing kind of a reaction against that. And that was true, well before even his cancer diagnosis last year. And some of the other races, and the congressional races especially, some of those are going to be very hard fought, and some pretty important ones, especially down here in Tucson and southern Arizona.
Well, and Democrats are looking to replace incumbent Governor Doug Ducey. Does it look like Ducey will be able to hold on to his position?
Doug Ducey has been not the most popular of governors with the Tea Party contingent, but amongst the broader group of Republicans, he's still a solidly respected mainstream business Republican, and it's going to be very, very hard for any of the three Democratic candidates, depending on who comes out of that primary tomorrow, to take him on and get him out of office. It's going to be an uphill battle for any of them, quite frankly.
All right, we'll be watching closely. Dylan Smith, thanks very much for your insight. That does it for this edition of Red and Blue. We'll see you back here on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern with special primary coverage and analysis late into the evening. More news after the break. You're streaming CBSN.